One of the original persons of interest was a woman? That's wild. Hey guys, this is Jules with True Crime Reactions. Disclaimer. Everything stated in this video is my opinion and my opinion only. And just like everything else in these cases we discuss here on this channel, everything is alleged. My YouTube buddy Mikey sent me this article from the New York Times. Now, unfortunately, it was behind a paywall, but whenever he told me the sort of information that was in the article, I paid the little $4, all right? Now, in this article, there is information that I have never seen before. And I really would love to know where old Mr. Mike Baker got this information from because damn, all right, I'm a little flustered by the fact that there's some for real info here that we never heard of. Now, I'm going to take this with a grain of salt, the same way that I have to everything that Howard Bloom says, right? My thing here is that this information seems to be information that was possibly received by the New York Times prior to there being a gag order, because a lot of the crazy, like, oh my gosh, information is stuff that was definitely pre-arrest. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that it's factual, but it's interesting, especially when it comes to one very important thing, the car being mentioned here. We've had issues with it being a different year. Then we've had Steve Goncalves make a slip up and say something different. And then we've had his vehicle being pulled by police officers prior to the incident even happening, and the car coming back as something completely different than what we're seeing it to be. Now, in this article, it lists a vehicle that I don't remember them ever saying anything about. So it'll be really interesting if this ends up being true, that they were originally looking for this type of vehicle, but the public didn't know anything. Because why? The very first vehicle they told us to look for was an Elantra. That's why whenever they said, hey, we're looking for this car, and then the Banfield footage dropped, and then we had the car crash in Oregon, everyone was like, what the hell? Because we all of a sudden had all these like ambushes of white Hyundai Elantras. They never mentioned anything to the public about a Nissan Sentra. And we know that we've already had some other slip-ups with the vehicle make and model already, so this definitely caught my attention. The other information in this article really got my attention, and I figured because it is behind a paywall that there might be a lot of you guys that haven't seen this info yet, and it's interesting. So we're going to go over it together because I scanned it. I haven't seen or read all of the details. Again, reaction channel to the most part. You know, I do my own thing, all right? But whenever I'm reacting to something, I like it to be as natural as possible. So I'll skim, see if it's worth the time, and then hit the camera. So let's go ahead and read this together because you guys, okay. Now this was posted over a year ago on June 10th of 2023. Okay, let's keep that in mind too, because there's been a whole lot of new information in the past year. But again, the stuff that ended up being really interesting to me and catching my attention is like pre-arrest stuff. So, okay. In the weeks after, 4 University of Idaho students were found slaughtered in a house near campus last November, a growing roster of investigators desperately searching for answers had yet to identify a suspect or even find the murder weapon. Publicly, the authorities were assuring worried residents in the small college town that they were making progress. Privately, they were exhausting their prospects, scouring through the backgrounds of those with the thinnest possible connections to the case. Through the first 2 weeks of December, investigators put some of their focus on classmates of the victims. They also widened the search to examine a man in another state who had been known to send harassing messages to women, but had visited Idaho only twice in his life. Okay, I instantly have questions. Why would you just have some rando person who sends horrible messages to people as one of the people that you instantly think of to go and question? Did this person send harassing messages to one of the victims, to either Dylan or Bethany even? Or is this some rando? Was there a connection whatsoever, or is this a random person with a bad reputation? Because that person wasn't even in Idaho. But could they have been in Washington? Just because it says another state doesn't mean it wasn't one close enough, right? Oh, it's kind of strange. They looked at a woman previously charged with assaults, more than one, in the region. I would love to know which female they thought could have been a suspect in this case. That's wild. They looked at a man once accused of wielding a knife. Now, I wonder if that is the man in black with a knife on a bicycle, I think it was, or maybe it just happened on a bike trail or something like that, because that happened, I think, like the night before, or maybe even earlier the same night as the murders. I can't really remember exactly. I just know that it was like crazy that we had like the dog situation and then this guy with a knife wearing all black situation, and apparently like none of them are all related. I don't know how, but okay. They looked at offenders, which we know that that's usually like the first thing that they do. They looked at a white supremacist. A single one, just a uno one, not a group of them, but just a one. Okay. Each turned out to be a dead end. Then, after spending weeks sifting through an array of evidence that seemed to lead nowhere, investigators announced an arrest in late December on the other side of the country. Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student from a nearby university. He was identified only after investigators turned to an advanced method of DNA analysis that had rarely been used in active murder investigations. Because again, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know where to look, which direction to even think of. They didn't have anything leading them to anything until they got the call from the feds saying, this is the family tree that you need to go down. And that's the story that they're telling us. That's how we are being made to believe it. The story of how dozens of officers from local, state, and federal agencies took the quadruple murder investigation into extraordinary territory is only now becoming more apparent through recently obtained records and interviews with people familiar with the investigation who discussed key details that emerged before the issuance of a gag order in the case. So they did go and get records from prior to the gag order. That's what I was wondering, because I'm like, damn, there's a lot of information in here. Because like when it gets to the car, guys, you're going to wonder, well, if that's what they were looking for, then why didn't they tell the public that's what they were looking for? That's why I'd love to know where this information really, really came from. They can go ahead and say recently obtained records and interviews from prior to the gag order. But is this information that they got like along the way and he just didn't write about it until now? Like in this June 10th of 2023 article? I don't know. Okay. The case has shown the degree at which law enforcement investigators have come to rely on the digital footprints that ordinary Americans leave in nearly every facet of their lives. Online shopping, car sales, carrying a cell phone, drives along city streets, and amateur genealogy all played roles in an investigation that was solved in the end as much through technology as traditional sleuthing. Okay, but for one, the car sales thing is interesting because as far as we can tell, it was like a Carfax that a bunch of people got after we found out the type of vehicle that Bryan had. And that's how we, got this information for Kylie Rodney's Honda too. Like that's pretty normal. Now the cell phone thing is interesting because now we know, now this, we didn't know this at the time this article was written. Okay, but now we know something that I repeat, I feel like in every video, that Cy Ray has now stated, according to his testimony in the court hearing, that the location and time specific information for the time that the crimes apparently happened is missing when it comes to cell phone and like other data, that he hasn't seen it to be of existence, which is a problem for the prosecution, especially with everything else that we already know. Now, this whole like drives along city streets thing, again, something else we've repeated quite a few times, and I guess I'll just have to keep repeating it as long as it keeps coming up, right? The videos and stuff they seem to have in this like 51 terabytes either don't contain Bryan's vehicle, according to things that Ann Taylor has stood up in court and stated, or they are not for the time of the crimes in question, but for other dates and other times, including like all daylight. A majority of the weather cams and stuff like that is daylight cameras. So I don't know how they're supposed to tell us that they have been able to track his vehicle in the dark whenever a lot of these cameras would be black and white and show even different vehicles of color as a certain shade in a black and white scale that would be hard to, decipher the difference between. But they also have like not a lot of night footage apparently in general. And the little bit of night footage that they do have, Ann Taylor again has stood up and said, that's not Bryan's car at that place. So why is it in evidence? It's not Bryan's. It makes it a lot more difficult to believe that the prosecution actually has anything of substance that we haven't seen yet, whenever everything that we have seen so far, there's 1,000 things wrong with it. I don't think anything has been presented so far that hasn't had a severe problem. But when it comes to him claiming that all of these great, like, technological things are going to be what solves this case, is that really accurate? I mean, not from what we've seen in court so far. Now indicted on 4 counts of murder, Mr. Kohberger has declined to enter a plea, but contended previously through his lawyer that he would be exonerated. Yes, he did. Investigators have yet to detail a possible motive, and to this day, over a year later, they still have not. If anything, as most of you guys already know, but for those of you who might not, they have made it more and more clear that there is less and less of a connection between Bryan Kohberger and the victims. So much so that they've stated there is none whatsoever. That there's no explanation for the lack of evidence in anything that he owns or is. And the prosecution has even now stood up and said he wasn't stalking them. He wasn't stalking them in real life or on social media. False statements. Wild, ain't it? To this day, family members of the victims remain unaware of any prior connections that the accused killer had with the 4 young people who were killed, because there wasn't any. The process of identifying and arresting a suspect took over 6 weeks. Weeks of increasing frustration and painstaking examination of evidence as the community pushed for answers. But said evidence isn't what got them their arrest. Remember, they state that all the time. They had all of this stuff in front of them that led to nowhere, and then all of a sudden, feds to the rescue. The first 911 call came in around noon, some 7 hours after the murders. What do you mean the first? Is there more than one? And we don't know? Wouldn't that be some shit? Maddie Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20, had been unalived overnight in their bedrooms. Initially, the Moscow Police Department described the attack as targeted and assured residents that there was no risk to the public. But with no indication of who had committed the attack or why, the authorities eventually backtracked. They backtracked a lot. We cannot say there is no threat to the community, the police chief James Fry said at a news conference on November 16th, 3 days after the killings. The department, which had only a few dozen officers, enlisted the Idaho State Police and the FBI to help, bringing in dozens of additional investigators. Forensic teams processed evidence from the bedrooms, snapped photos around the home's back door, and hunted for footprints. Others searched for surveillance video from around town. And again, what we've learned about the surveillance video is it's in the daylight, it's the wrong date, it's not timed. It's for times and dates that don't work for their timeline. It's for times and dates that are completely irrelevant to what they need in order to put anything together. And that's not us just like talking. Okay, this is literally what they're claiming in court. It's on transcript, all right? A week after the killings, records show investigators were on the lookout for a certain type of vehicle, Nissan Sentras, from the model years 2019 to 2023. A week. So 7 days after the murders, they were looking for Nissan Sentras, fairly new ones, like literally could have been one of the more brand new ones that were coming out the following year. Because remember, this happened November of 2022. So they were technically looking for a brand new freaking Nissan Sentra. Didn't say a word to the public. Didn't say a word. That's crazy to me. I am just befuddled. If this is true, I am befuddled. Quietly. See, quietly. Why quietly? Why quietly? Quietly. They ran down details on thousands of such vehicles, including the owner's addresses, license plate numbers, and the color of each sedan. But further scrutiny of the video footage produced more clarity, and on November 25th, the police in Moscow asked law enforcement agencies to look for a different type of car with a similar shape. White Hyundai Elantras from the model years of 2011 and 2023. So we already had issues with the fact that they gave us the wrong year model to look at in the first place, right? Because they claimed that this FBI agent that was doing the like car thing had done this for, was it 35 years? It's either 20 or 35. I think 20 years is how long Cyre's been doing stuff. I think the vehicle dude was like 35 years or some crap like that. I could be wrong, but I remember it being like a long time to get it wrong. To get it wrong. And now to know that they didn't get it wrong once, they got it wrong twice? What? So is the Nissan Sentra supposed to be the DoorDash car? Could that be the DoorDash car? Is the Nissan Sentra? And after going back and re-looking at footage, that's how they figured out they had the wrong car? Or are they mixed up again and they got it wrong again? Or is it the exact same car that they are now telling us is a Hyundai Elantra that they originally thought was a Nissan Sentra? It wasn't two different cars that they misconstrued or got the tracks wrong and didn't know who was who. They really had the car wrong completely. So we're supposed to just keep believing these exact same people who keep getting stuff wrong back to back to back to back to back. And again, as quickly as they came out and told us that they were looking for the white Hyundai Elantra. I mean, it wasn't too quick. Obviously, they gave the cops a little bit of time because it says that on November 25th is whenever they were telling people about the white Hyundai Elantras. And we know that it wasn't until like the 29th that the officers at the school over at WSU looked in the system for that white Hyundai Elantra type vehicle, right? So you're telling me that for 2 weeks practically, they just kept the whole like Nissan Sentra thing quiet? Why? Who did they think that it belonged to for them to be so freaking quiet? Why wouldn't you ask the freaking public for help with that the second you got the vehicle? I mean, they would have looked even more, incompetent because it was apparently the wrong one. But why keep quiet? Why keep quiet? That makes it look like they literally reverse engineered this case even more so. Does it not? Just across the state border at Washington State University, campus police officers began looking through their records for Elantras registered there. Among those they found was one registered to Mr. Kohberger, who had moved to the area earlier in 2022 to pursue a PhD in criminology. They checked Mr. Kohberger's car more closely, according to a court affidavit, the one written by Brett Payne, including visiting the parking lot near his apartment in the early morning hours of November 29th, like I just mentioned. But the vehicle was a 2015 model, not the earlier models being sought in Moscow. The next day, records show investigators in Moscow were also looking closely at another vehicle, Miss Goncalves' car, Kaylee's Range Rover. She had purchased a 2015 Range Rover in the days before her death. Detectives gathered information on the registration, history, and legal owners, clearly interested in the history of who had owned the car, but once again, the information provided few answers. Why? Did she not get it off like a used car lot? I guess we don't know, do we? Actually, somebody probably does. I'm pretty sure somebody ran a Carfax the same way they did on Bryan. So if anybody knows anybody who has that information, could you let me know down in the comments? Because if you're getting it off of a used car lot, then why did the cops seem to know of the previous history? Like, did they think that the person was like up to no good and it was like a hit gone wrong because they saw the wrong vehicle? I mean, obviously the tag would have been different than what it would have been whenever the previous owner had it. Like the license plate would have been different, wouldn't it have been? I know that every single time that I've changed vehicles, my license plate changes with it. So I would love to know why they were looking at that. That's a bit crazy to me. With students at the University of Idaho preparing for final exams, there was a permanent sense of apprehension in the air as people began locking their doors, acquiring pepper spray, and asking on social media how such a brazen killer could remain undetected for so long in a town that had not seen a murder in 7 years. The hunt broadened as investigators vacuumed up more records and data. They had already sought cell phone data for all phones that pinged cell towers within a half-mile of the victim's house from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., according to search warrant filings. They collected victims' bank records, email correspondence, and social media account data. On December the 5th, detectives made a new request for surveillance video, seeking all footage recorded on UPS delivery trucks in the days before and after the killings. This isn't USPS. This isn't the United States Postal Service. This is UPS delivery, which is basically like FedEx. And I don't understand what that means, because what they're trying to tell us when it comes to the knife is that they are wanting us to believe that Bryan purchased this Amazon purchase before he moved. Like he bought the K-bar through Amazon whenever he still lived in Pennsylvania, is what they want us to believe. And if that's the case, then why are you getting delivery truck footage? Is it because you're looking to see who picked up the package, who the person is that the UPS driver actually handed something to, or what? I would love to know. I would love to know. I don't know why that's bothered me so much, but that's one part of this that I have never been able to not think about, because I have no clue what the hell it means. Okay. The next day, after getting back data on Miss Goncalves' account on the Tinder dating app, detectives asked for details on 19 specific account holders, including their locations, credit card information, and any private images, pictures, or videos associated with the accounts. So that tells me right there that Kaylee was entertaining 19 different people on her Tinder account. Now, that doesn't mean that she was sleeping with all 19 people. So for anybody that has comprehension issues, this next 2 minutes of conversation might be too much for you. Anyway, this means to me that she was having at least 19 different conversations. Because for somebody to just send her a message and her not to respond, unless it was something that was instantly threatening, there'd be no reason for them to look into those 19 people. Just because she matched with 19 people wouldn't be a reason for them to look into those people either. There would have to be some sort of actual communication back and forth, especially since right here they're saying, yeah, we're also looking at private images, pictures, or videos associated with those accounts and what they talked about with Kaylee. That's why, I still fall on the whole, there was no her and Jack getting back together. And I feel like Jack was fine with it. And I feel like Kaylee was fine with it. And all that stuff that was going on the phones that night. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about it. But unless the Goncalveses are lying, they have stated that there was a voicemail that they heard from Jack's phone that was left by Kaylee in those phone calls. And it had something to do with the dog. It wasn't about them getting back together. Now, it could have been about sleeping together. Kaylee was drunk. It's very possible. That's what exes do sometimes. All right, that's possible. But she was talking to people online. He wasn't answering the phone. And I think that he was just a guy not answering the phone for his drunk ex-girlfriend. That's about as innocent as I think it was. Seriously. For them to have gotten information for 19 specific account holders, to me, means there was some sort of communication. Now, could she have gone on dates with all 19 of these people? Could there have been some sort of personal information given out to these 19 people about maybe where she went to school or maybe where she worked and something like that? Yeah, possible. But again, I don't think that they would be looking for these 19 people's specific information just because they matched. I feel like there would have to be some sort of conversation, some sort of back and forth. That's just my opinion. The request allowed the inquiry to go much broader than an ordinary search for information, using a single warrant to target 19 different people, said Orrin Kerr, a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley. You couldn't get one warrant to search 19 houses, he said. Yeah, that's true. Investigators were also working with a key piece of evidence, a K-bar knife sheath branded with a U.S. Marine Corps logo that had been found next to two of the victims. They initially began looking for local stores that may have sold the weapon and then fanned out. A request to Amazon sought the order histories of account holders who had purchased such knives. A follow-up request to eBay focused on a series of specific users seeking their purchase histories. Some had connections to the area, including one in Idaho and two in Washington state, while others were from far away, including an account in Japan. Because of redactions, it is unclear if Mr. Kohberger's name came up on those records. Do you see that? See, I like the way that he put that, because this isn't, oh yeah, no, we have proof he bought it off Amazon. No, because we don't have proof he bought it off Amazon. We never did have proof he bought it off Amazon. And I've been saying this for a long time, and I don't know why Coffin Daffer and Ashley Banfield and Nancy Grace and so many others keep claiming that, because that's not true. What we have is an alleged serial number that they believe is the serial number for the item number for the knife sheath and the knife together being bought. Because you don't just buy the sheath or buy the knife. You buy the knife that comes with the knife sheath. You buy the set. It's a thing. But I do remember seeing this list. I don't know if I still have a copy of it, but I will look for it. I remember seeing this list. The overall data track was growing enormous, demonstrating the extensive breadth of data on consumer platforms that can be made accessible to law enforcement agencies when they are at the stage of hunting for breadcrumbs. Yeah, pretty much like every social media portal, they have a portal. Every social media platform has a portal that these law enforcement agencies can go to and submit requests, and then also like pull their data, their evidence from. You could say this is uncharted territory, Mr. Kerr said. There are novel legal questions when there are so many records out there. At the same time, DNA from the scene was being processed. Forensic teams had examined the knife sheath and found DNA that did not belong to any of the inhabitants of the house. They ran the sample through the FBI's database, which contains millions of DNA profiles of past criminal offenders, but according to 3 people briefed on the case, they did not get a match. So that's 3 different people claiming that, which we already knew that. At that point, investigators decided to try genetic genealogy, a method that until now has been used primarily to solve cold cases, not active murder investigations. Among the growing number of genealogy websites that help people trace their ancestors and relatives via their own DNA, some allow users to select an option that permits law enforcement to compare crime scene DNA samples against the website's data. But what we've also learned is that even whenever you opt out of those things, there are loopholes that law enforcement has learned that they then use and violate your privacy rights knowingly. And then they use it as admissible evidence in court. Beautiful, isn't it? A distant cousin who has opted into the system can help investigators building a family tree from crime scene DNA to triangulate and identify a potential perpetrator of a crime. In one of the best known uses of genealogy in solving a cold case, detectives in 2018 were able to arrest a suspect in a string of attacks and murders years before in California that had been attributed to the so-called Golden State Killer. That's true. Once a suspect is identified, a direct genetic comparison can be used as confirmation before making an arrest. With a few formal regulations, the use of mass genealogy databases has raised concerns about privacy and whether limits should be placed on how the method is used. But authorities across the country say they have found potential in the system to produce leads that are unattainable through traditional investigative efforts. You mean only attainable whenever you break the law? Is that what you mean? Barbara Ray Vinter, a genealogy consultant who worked on the Golden State Killer case, said there was now growing interest in using genealogical DNA, not just in cold cases, but also in active crime investigations. That is why the Idaho case is so interesting, she said. To do the genealogical analysis, the Idaho State Police contracted with a private company, Othram, in Texas, which had a lab able to produce a more extensive DNA profile from the knife sheath than a state lab was set up to examine. Okay, but then the feds came in and snatched it. And they're not putting it that way. The way that we've been told this whole time was that Othram was given the stuff, and then the feds came in and told them to shut it down, that they were taking over. The way that this is worded doesn't make it sound that way. FBI personnel worked with the profile that Othram had produced, according to two people familiar with the investigation, spending days building out a family tree that began with a distant relative. So the actual lab, that is the one that is getting all of the most recent accolades for solving all these cases, is not the one that actually finalized the product that they used to arrest Bryan Kohberger, which is what we knew this whole time. Which is why I always questioned why Othram was involved to begin with, if the feds were working the case. The federal government has the most high-tech equipment that money can't buy, okay? So I never understood that. If the feds were already there, why did Othram even have to come in? Because all they did was stop them from finishing their job. It doesn't make sense. By the morning of December 19th, records show investigators had a name: Bryan Kohberger. He had a white Elantra. He was a student at a university 8 miles from the murder scene. Mr. Kohberger was already out of town, his semester complete. He had driven home with his father to Pennsylvania, stopped twice by the police along the way for what officers said was tailgating. Just as agents began to scour his background more thoroughly, he had been terminated from his position as a teaching assistant after what was described as altercations with a professor. And I will say again, we went over this in this video. We went through everything that we have document-wise from WSU, from them giving him paperwork of, trespassing paperwork. And we've gone through the timeline that News Nation, because only News Nation has given us this timeline, okay? News Nation gave us for the arguments he's apparently had with his male professor that caused him all these issues. But the whole point of this is that they are trying to blame him losing his job as a TA and in turn losing his funding to continue his education on the reason why he committed these murders, but also claiming that he was terminated from his position after the murders took place. And that's ass backwards. So I don't know why they keep hounding on that so much, but that's not logical. On December 23rd, investigators sought and received Mr. Kohberger's cell phone records. The results added more to their suspicions. His phone was moving around in the early morning hours of November 13th, but was disconnected from cell networks, perhaps turned off in the 2 hours around the killings occurred. But we've got a whole bunch of new information now, especially a bunch of local people who are now coming out and saying, yeah, the service is crap. I always lose service whenever I go west. Because that's what Bryan's alibi is actually claiming, that whenever he left his apartment, he went west. He didn't go on the Moscow, Idaho highway that takes like 10 minutes to get from town to town. He didn't go east at all. He went west. And west, you get into more country-ish areas, more like farmland and winding roads, and you lose service. 4 days later, agents in Pennsylvania managed to retrieve some trash from Mr. Kohberger's family residence, sending the material to the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab. Checking it against their original DNA profile, the lab was able to reach a game-changing conclusion. The DNA in the trash belonged to a close relative of whoever had left DNA on the knife sheath. Okay, I know this is just claiming like close relative, but it's very much more specific in the exhibit. Mr. Kohberger was arrested on December 30th. So yeah, the 19th is whenever the feds would have called over to MPD and said, this is who you need to look for. And what is that, 11 days? 11 days later, they had him arrested. But that's still insane to me, guys, because they went through all kinds of other stuff and never even came up with like an inkling that it could possibly have been Bryan. And then come to find out all the way in the beginning of this, they weren't even looking for a Hyundai. They were looking for a Nissan. And again, I would love to know if the same so-called expert that got it wrong before is the exact same one who got it wrong this time too. Or do we have two incompetent people? I mean, we know we have more than that here. But do we have two incompetent car people on top of everything else? That's crazy to me. But I wanted to read this article to you guys because there was some information in there that we had never heard before. And I felt like sharing it. So again, thank you to Mikey for sending me this article. Lots of information about the Nissan, which we did that other video about all the rest of the cars that we've heard about in here. And now all this other stuff that basically just reiterated to me how much more this doesn't make a lot of sense. And again, this was written well over a year ago, and we know that we have a lot more information now. But this seems to be information that was obtained probably prior to the gag order. Honestly, probably prior to the gag order, and for some reason they didn't write about it until June of 2023. If it's true. But again, how do we know? How do we know? We don't. We don't know what's true. We don't know what's boo-boo. We don't know what's a distraction. We don't know anything. Besides that none of it makes sense. That's all we know. But that's it, you guys. That's it. If you like the way that I present this information and give my opinion, please do not forget to leave a like on your way out and subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed already. See y'all.